Well guys, it looks like Biden managed to win after all. I was of course very happy for my American comrades and pushing Trump out, right after I was done quickly deleting all my Bernie Water 1 drafts I'd made back in March. Now though, with liberals back to brunch and conservatives in perpetual cope, it's time for the left to figure out what it wants to do with these next 4 to 8 years. Because as we all know, this is certainly not the end, and another Trump is only round the corner. In fact, it might even literally be Trump. At the same time though, protests, fighting evictions, and preparing for riots are less around the corner as much as they are happening right now, and so the left has a lot to consider. Where do we want to focus our efforts among all of this? What should we be doing? Now obviously when I say we, I mean the American left. I don't have a hand in any of this. But hey, what is the left but international? America may be the centre of attention right now, but decisions about organisational methods apply all the same to any liberal democracy teetering on the edge between neoliberalism and right-wing populism. So you know, all of them. There's a lot of excitement going around now about using Biden's inevitable disappointments in office to convince liberals of the need for more social democratic candidates like AOC, or perhaps even a Bernie 2028 run, pushing the party further left to enact change. This is the position advocated for by popular leftist streamer Vaush, and many other leftists too. Of course, you'll be able to find many variations on this position by other leftists, but being one of the largest platforms among the online left right now, we can agree our comrade Vaush makes for a good representation. During the election, Vaush posted the video "If Biden Wins," outlining his ideas for what the left should do under a Biden presidency, which I'll do my best to summarize here, but I do of course encourage you to go and watch it on your own, just to double check.
What do we do now that Biden has won? Is this a victory for us? Yes, it is. Bernie did great after 8 years of Obama. Bernie did worse after 4 years of Trump. We're about to get Biden. And we're about to get Biden in an era where more and more people are getting radicalized by the world around them. Biden is not a great candidate. How do we maximize our outcomes here? Well, here's a couple of suggestions. First of all, your job is to move liberals left, okay? I don't give a fuck if you are taking existing lefties and agreeing with them. You're useless. Sorry, you're useless, okay? I don't care. They're already lefties! That is the next 4 years I want to spend. I want to spend it ruthlessly making fun of the Democrats in a way that maximizes the positive optics with liberals.
The crux of Vaush's idea revolves around leveraging popular support within the base of the Democratic Party to vote in progressive candidates, like AOC and the Squad, into positions of power and ideally nominations for presidency, using the failures that will come with Biden's neoliberalism as a way to convince Democrats that this is not only the better course of action, but also the only way to reliably defeat Republican opposition, lest the next right-wing populist has an easy shot at a neoliberal establishment candidate a la Trump versus Hillary.
You don't want there to be another Trump in 4 years, do you? No, I really don't!
Any radicals among you, though, may immediately begin to question, what does this have to do with socialism? Isn't this just the tactics of any regular social democrat? And well, yes it is. But to Vaush's credit, he isn't your average social democrat. He does have a firm belief in socialism underlying these positions. In Vaush's view, a straight avocation of socialism right now is simply infeasible, and a much more pragmatic approach would be to create the conditions for social democracy to take hold such that socialism can become a more viable alternative out of it. This is more speculation, but perhaps in a similar way to using the failures of neoliberalism to push social democracy, Vaush might one day hope to use the inevitable failures of social democracy, inevitable because, at the end of the day, social democracy is still a mode of capitalism, to push socialism. I do think there is value in what Vaush wants to do here. His ideas for convincing liberals are good, I think he has that down. My problems lie less with what he has said, and more with what's being left unsaid. His ideas revolve almost entirely around acting within the Democratic Party, focusing on electoral politics, with no mention of acting outside of them as an independent external movement, or even building the basis of something from which a movement could grow out of to begin with. I have no problem with doing both, and for reasons I'm going to explain later, I actually think it's necessary, but right now we're not doing both. We're doing just one. The motivation for many to focus on party politics might be its sense of immediacy. There is a visible hope in the DNC, with new progressive candidates gaining practical traction, compared to the vague concept of a revolution, which has always been alluded to, but can sometimes feel like a bunch of leftists sitting around waiting in reading groups, interspersed with occasional outbursts like Occupy or Chaz, but which never really leads to anything lasting. As such, then you could honestly be forgiven for wanting to cast aside radicalism, direct action, or base building until such a time that revolution really is realistic, until the material conditions are there, but I'm afraid this would still be flawed. The fact is, if we want revolution, insurrection, any kind of real socialism to ever be an option, which surely as socialists we do, we can't sit around waiting for them in the ballot box. Revolutionary periods present themselves through inevitable capitalist crises, through which the material conditions of society become so degraded that people are ready for radical change. But these conditions don't automatically deliver us to socialism. Accelerationism does us no favours here. There's something that has to be seized by an existing leftist force, people who are prepared to make things happen, armed with the history of revolutions before them and the theory to apply to their unique circumstances today. This doesn't necessarily mean some Leninist vanguard prepared to take the reins of a working class revolution, just an existing leftist force which can immediately kick into action. Without this, we either get short-lived embarrassments in the form of Chaz, or worse yet, see these opportunities slip to the fascists instead, ready to play on people's desperation. In short, we have to work to prepare ourselves for revolutionary times in non-revolutionary times if we ever want to be able to do something when given the chance. And what better time to prepare for the future than a Biden presidency? And perhaps some of you are just so black-pilled by now that the idea of naked revolution has long since left your minds. But even still, the only reason not to focus on base building is a further, frankly naive belief that the instability of capitalism too is a thing of the past, and that as an extension, the threat of a force of fascism acting outside of electoralism is also no longer realistic. Because if it is the case that fascism on the streets is still a threat, which to believe otherwise right now is simply delusional, then refusing to prepare an independent leftist movement is simply handing society over to the fascists in advance. Because no amount of entryism into the DNC will stop fascists on the streets. Even Antifa direct action working to impede fascist mobilization is still useless if the liberalism it's trying to preserve crumbles beneath it. Regardless though, these concepts of revolution may seem so far into the future that they're simply too hard to grasp, but let me ask you, how long are we waiting for an AOC nominee? 8 years, if not more? Think about the political climate between now and 2012. Isn't it fair to say that almost anything is possible by 2028? The fact is that protests, riots, general political instability have been consistently on the rise since 2008, and there's no reason anybody can give as to why they'll stop now on the brink of a new economic recession. I understand that socialism can seem like a far stretch from the mind of the public right now, but there kind of is and isn't. There are two issues we see today that can get almost anybody challenging the fundamentals of society, that being climate change and more immediately police reform, with of course the knowledge that the police cannot actually be reformed. For me, it's not about bringing the average Dem Party member to the left, as nice as that would be, but more about convincing the people who were only months ago literally fighting with the police in the streets. But Muke, you might ask. These people are already leftists, aren't they? What is appealing to them going to achieve? Well, no, they're actually not. Think for a moment how many people engaged in the George Floyd protests. Estimates are in the ballpark of 20 million. And despite what Fox News might tell you, there are not 20 million hardline leftists in the streets of the US. Many were just regular people, tired of seeing more innocent people murdered by the police, not the edgy Twitter MLs we've come to associate with those refusing to vote for Biden, even though many, especially among the initial riots, likely shared a similarly low turnout rate. These are people who would never choose an ideological label for themselves, they're just normal people. Normal people who are very open to the idea of radically changing society, even if they don't necessarily know how. These are the people we completely gloss over when we focus solely on Democratic Party apparatus. And they're the people that if you just got involved with any kind of organizational work, got them talking to anybody with even a rough idea of socialist theory, could instantly jump miles to the left themselves, and actually start calling for socialist revolution once they understand how it addresses the problems they're already angry about. It's these people that when armed with the knowledge of socialism or in contact with leftist support networks can actually make things happen the next time people take to the streets and take charge during the next Chaz. See, this is where I really begin to diverge from Vaush. His ideas are good at convincing politically active, card-carrying liberals, by which I mean anybody invested enough to argue on Twitter, but miss out so many more people who are even more readily convinced of leftist ideas, and are arguably even more useful to do so. What Vaush advocates for is social democratic entryism into the Democratic Party. That is, spreading social democratic ideas across the member base and pushing social democratic candidates such that then further left control of the party can then take place. While I argue for socialist entryism into existing social movements, like BLM or Extinction Rebellion. XR isn't really a thing anymore, but the next time something like it is, we should be all over it, because that's where those easily radicalized liberals who are desperate for something more are. In a phrase then, we need to devote more of our organizational work not to convincing people to agree with us, but mobilizing the people who already do and may just not know it yet. But, as I've said, there is still room for action within the Democratic Party, albeit not quite in the way I suspect people like Vaush expect. Typically, politics is seen as an incremental affair, or perhaps a tug of war with an opposition. We're often reminded with popular figures like Bernie Sanders or AOC that personally they may hold deeply radical beliefs, but they could never advocate for these directly, and instead they must work within the current Overton window to make some change now rather than none. Which for the record is true, but the fact is that when we're strictly concerned with what brings us closer to socialism, within the concept of liberal democracy, things like policy change is largely an irrelevant factor. Defunding the police does not bring us one step closer to abolishing the police. Promoting cooperative workplaces does not bring us closer to abolishing private property. These are variations on the same fundamental thing we ultimately seek to do away with. It's the same thing of the localized version, that industrial action for higher wages is good, but again, doesn't abolish wage labour. And so, a radical alternative like socialism only becomes an option through spontaneous and disruptive events which bring the whole system into question at once, not through a series of reforms eventually landing us there. We have an example of this only this year with the George Floyd riots. The notions of radicalism among these movements are often downplayed, but regardless of your position here, it should be obvious that to the people who are actually on the ground at the forefront of these riots, radical change most definitely appeared to be a realistic option when only a week before it would have remained out of their minds altogether. The sudden spark of, hey, let's chase the police out of our cities, is something that can only come about through these spontaneous events, no matter how far you shift the overturn window. It's the same dynamic at play in actual genuine revolutions throughout history, just on a larger scale. But despite this unique nature of radical action, the electoral process is still actually a fantastic tool at our disposal with which to build up the types of movements we need. Having progressive, populist candidates gain momentum within the Democratic Party is not only good for the reform and the harm reduction they bring about, but it is also very useful for the cause of socialism too. The reason is simple: populist candidates invariably build grassroots mass movements around them. People who feel unheard by current establishments, who are aware of the really important issues today and are desperate for real change to them. Sound familiar? They're the exact same people who I've been arguing we need to reach out to all the time already. Populist social democratic candidates act as a rallying beacon for these people, not only bringing them together, but energizing them to get more involved in politics than they've ever been before. It's these beacons that radical movements like our own can capitalize on to build support for a movement independent from electoral politics altogether, one capable of organized direct action. In fact, we've literally already been seeing this over the last 4 years through Trump and the alt-right, which is the same dynamic but on the other side. As soon as Trump was elected, further right groups and organizations swelled in membership and acted with bolstered confidence up until their defeat in Charlottesville. The right wing were already making use of those opportunities of populist candidates when it's presented to them. It's up to us as leftists to do the same. This is why I'm still wholly in support of social democratic entryism into the Democratic Party. It just can't be all we do, especially in climates like what we have right now, where the party politics is still firmly in the hands of neoliberals, but on the ground action is abundant. We can be generous to Vaush and assume that he actually has no objections to any of these ideas alongside of his own. But this is irrelevant if it's not what he's already stating in his content where he proposes what the left should be doing. Vaush, buddy, you got a big platform, you have to use it right. We need external leftist movements ready to work on our goals at all times, regardless of how long-term they may be, because otherwise they'll never happen. Even if new candidates do gain populist traction within the Democratic Party, it will be useless to the broader left if there isn't already something ready to capitalize on the resulting mass movements which form. This is why Vaush's ideas, as they stand, can really only ever be run-of-the-mill social democracy, at least in reality, regardless of what his intentions may be. What I want to do is provide that framework to take it that one step further into something we could actually call socialist. Now, lastly, even if you find yourself agreeing with a lot of what I've been saying here, you still might find yourself wondering, what does any of this mean for the average leftist watching? What can I actually do? This is of course the age-old question, right? And it's really something you have to decide for yourself. But I hope I can at least get you started. First off, modern communist orgs, PSL, IMT, SWP, what have you, generally suck. Don't waste your time with them because they honestly do more harm than any good, be they ML, Trotskyist, or whatever. The reasons for this are quite elaborate, and I have a separate video delving into them, which I highly recommend any developing leftist give a watch. But the short of it is that they're typically very stagnant, stuck in early 20th century ideology, won't force a party line on your positions, and, in the long term, fill your head with a bunch of bullshit that's just going to alienate and isolate you off from the rest of the left. I know these are quite sweeping statements, but again, I refer you to my video. So for now, just know that I do not recommend these places as somewhere to begin. What you should do is put these ideas of socialist entryism into action. If you live in a city, find your local activist and lefty groups, from BLM to DSA chapters, and start attending meetings. Try and be the voice of socialism in everything they do. Don't be preachy about it, and don't come off as if you don't actually give a shit about whatever they're already doing and are just there to siphon members off for your own thing. Just be involved and try and push people to think about the socialist alternative whenever the opportunity is there. Then there's industrial action and rent strikes, which activist groups can be a great channel to get involved through as well. And I shouldn't have to tell you that these are also fantastic to be involved in and great places to act as a socialist presence. If you're a university student, get involved in your leftist societies and clubs on campus and do the exact same shit. If there aren't any strictly communist or socialist societies around already, start your own. I've done this myself and it's a lot of work, but I promise it will also be very rewarding. And if done right, can offer a real socialist backbone to the wider left at your campus. If you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere with no other leftists around you, then even just reading theory is still very productive and important for everyone regardless of where they are. We all definitely forget sometimes that a requirement to effectively convincing people is a strong theoretical background from which to draw from. If you can, make efforts to find a handful of other leftists in your local area and start reading groups. Just building up that network of fellow leftists alone will already put you miles ahead of where you've started. This is all advice I feel can work at any point in time, but let's not forget the conditions we're living under right now as well. We're still in the midst of a pandemic, with a new economic recession and mass evictions taking place right now. This culminates into giving leftists more of an opportunity than for the last several decades to make change and build up movements directly in the streets. Get involved in mutual aid for the self-isolating, help prevent evictions wherever you can, and get people involved in those interested in socialism. This is the work we need to be doing alongside trying to move the Democratic Party left, to prepare ourselves for the next mass lootings, the next police stations burnt down, and the next autonomous zones. We'll have plenty more of those to deal with before the next Trump, so let's make the most of them.